Canada created its casualty identification program nearly 2 decades ago. But for the first time since that work started, officials have positively identified the remains of a Jewish soldier. This one has been missing since the First World War. He was found only recently buried under a French battlefield site. They've identified him as Private Bert Henry Detmold. He was living at the time near Roblin, Manitoba, where he had a farm homestead. But his background couldn't have been more different. He was born into one of the most prominent Jewish families in Victorian Britain. His mother, Nellie, was part of the Isaacs family of merchants in London. Her younger brother, Rufus Isaacs, was better known as Lord Reading. He rose to become Britain's Chief Justice, a diplomat, and later Viceroy of India, one of the most powerful figures in the British Empire of the time. He even had a power station in Israel in Tel Aviv that bore his name. When the First World War broke out, Albert Detmold enlisted in Winnipeg with the Canadian Expeditionary Force's Pioneer Battalion. In 1916, he went overseas to England. By 1917, they sent him to one of the most famous Canadian military battles, Vimy Ridge. He survived there, but he didn't make it through the first day of Canada's next major operation, the Battle of Hill 70, in August 1917. Detmold was 33 years old. He had no known grave for more than 100 years, but that's going to change.
In many senses, Private Detmold was lost twice, where his story was lost to his family, not only his remains, but that knowledge of who he was and what he'd done. And so being able to share his story with his family, being able to bring that story back to them, and then not only being able to bring the story of his service back, but also the knowledge that that his remains have been found and identified was, I think, really special.
I'm Ellin Bessner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Friday, March 27th, 2026. Welcome to North Star, the flagship podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granofsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. In 2020, French workers found some remains under a battlefield, along with important pieces of the unknown soldier's uniform and his kit. That helped the Canadian military history experts trace the unit. Then the team used forensics, DNA testing, and genealogy sleuthing to narrow down who he might be from among the 27,000 Canadians still listed as missing from last century's wars. It took several years, but they found his next of kin in Western Canada. They weren't looking for him, and they didn't even know much about Detmold's Jewish roots, which it seems have been long abandoned. Private Detmold didn't tell the army he was Jewish when he enlisted. His paperwork had him down as a Presbyterian. Right now, it's unclear whether his final resting place in a Commonwealth War cemetery in France will have a Star of David on the headstone when the formal burial and ceremony happens in July. His relatives, for now, aren't giving interviews. But I sat down this week with 3 members of Canada's Casualty Identification Program team who solved Detmold's case. Dr. Sarah Lockyer is a forensic anthropologist, and Alexandra McKinnon and Melissa Davidson are historians. Welcome to the Canadian Jewish News' North Star podcast, all of you. It's an honor to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, we're here because the Canadian government's announced, after so many years of research, you were able to identify a First World War Canadian Expeditionary Force soldiers' remains. Maybe we should just start, before we get into the how you came across the remains and how this came to Canadian attention.
This particular set of human remains was found in 2020 as a result of some construction work, which is the vast majority of the circumstances of the discoveries of the cases that we work on today. We're working towards identifying 45 other sets of human remains, and the vast majority of them is because of construction work, mostly found by munitions clearing companies. So the ground in France and in Belgium has a ton of unexploded ordnance. So these munitions clearing companies go through first to make sure, of course, that all the unexploded bombs and ammunition is removed from the soil before anything is built on top of it. And they are the ones who typically stumble on human remains. What happens is that Commonwealth War Graves Commission is called in first. They will do the recovery of the human remains. And then, based on the artifacts, the history of the location where the human remains were discovered, they'll then reach out to the appropriate nation to see if they're able to identify that individual. So each nation is responsible for the identification of their own soldiers.
Where exactly were his remains found? And in what was found with them?
They were found in near the city of Lens in northern France. And your typical military artifacts were found. So you had boots, you had sort of like a pickaxe, a gas mask. There were a lot of uniform buttons. But most importantly, in this particular case, there was a badge from the 107th Overseas Battalion, which then allows us to kind of really narrow down who this could potentially be.
And where is that in consideration to First World War battles that we would have heard of?
I'm going to give this one to Melissa, who's the historian on this. So,
Lens is located not geographically very far from Vimy Ridge, and the Battle of Hill 70 takes place in August of 1917, so a few months after Vimy, which is a battle that people know. But the war has moved on from Vimy Ridge, and so it's a completely separate battle. It's fought by the Canadian Corps, and they're trying to take a strategic high ground called Hill 70, which is near the town of Lens, in order to try and force the Germans to withdraw from the town and capture that. They do succeed in capturing the high ground after many days of difficult fighting, but they have trouble getting the Germans out of the city itself. In the overall strategic context, not only are they trying to capture the city, but they're also trying to distract from the fighting that's just starting in Belgium around Passchendaele, or what will ultimately become the Battle of Passchendaele.
I mean, Hill 70 is pretty famous, Vimy Ridge, of course, and Passchendaele. Now, our casualty, our Canadian soldier, how did he end up where he was found?
So pioneer battalions are trained infantrymen, but their primary task isn't to fight. Their primary task is to do combat engineering. And so the 107th was assigned to follow the attacking battalions while the battle is still going on, so in the first hours of the battle. And the men of the 107th are assigned tasks like digging out communication trenches. And so Private Detmold's remains were found near the junction of a communication trench that we know the 107th was working on the 15th of August, on that first day of the Battle of Hill 70.
And do we know where he fought before or where he was stationed or posted before, after leaving Canada?
I think that's Alex.
So Private Detmold joined the 107th Battalion pretty much immediately. So he enlisted on Valentine's Day 1916, just as the 107th was recruiting from across the prairies. He signs up out of Winnipeg. And so he initially goes through training in Canada at Camp Hughes in Manitoba. There's a bit more training that takes place in England at that point at a place called Whitley Camp. And it's at that point in time where the 107th is converted into a pioneer battalion. So they start learning those basic combat engineering tasks that Melissa mentioned. The 107th actually heads to France on the 25th of February, 1917. And so a few days after that, they arrive at a place called Écoeuvres, where they're involved in the preparations for the attack on Vimy Ridge. So we know that certainly for a good part of 1917, up until he's killed, Private Detmold is involved in that day-to-day work of pioneer battalions. They're doing things like preparing ammunition dumps, burying communication cables, while they're also doing things like training with bayonets, maintaining light railway tracks, they're clearing roads, they're consolidating trenches, they're doing all of that work that's necessary for advances to continue.
Sarah, how unusual is it to find boots and all this other stuff, gas masks, when you unearth these remains? It's almost 110 years later.
it's actually quite common to find pieces of the boots, military uniform, not the fabric, but we'll get things that are made out of metal or plastic. We'll find those. The gas mask, entrenching tools, anything made out of metal tends to survive very well.
There were actual bones, too?
Yes, actual bones. And that is, again, quite common. Now, if we
Like
find
the whole
ourselves
skeleton was there? Or
in this particular situation, no, it was not the entire skeleton, but a very large portion of the skeleton is found.
Aside from the 107th Battalion badge, another clue that we were looking for somebody involved in that basic combat engineering work is that this person was found with a pickaxe as well.
so do we know how he was killed? Does it show what happened to him? A lot of families want to know.
No. To be frank, that's not something that when I'm analyzing the human remains, that's not something that I'm looking to specifically be able to determine as to how each individual died. One thing to remember is that a lot of injuries may not actually appear on bone. If it's a flesh wound, as an example, that's obviously not going to appear on bones. So it's quite possible that the way he died does not appear on the skeleton. And furthermore, the biological information in the personnel files or in the war diaries don't necessarily offer specifics as Private X died of this. Getting that information from the skeleton doesn't actually reveal much useful information in trying to identify that person. They died
Mm,
of war, is what we tend to say.
right.
From
So,
the historical
yeah, go ahead.
context, we
Hmm.
can make statements of likelihood. So
Please.
we know that in the early stages of the Battle of Hill 70, the German artillery was very active. And so there were a large number of casualties as a result of shell fire and artillery fire. And the circumstances suggest that this is not unlikely, just given that he is found with a number of items that suggest that he was not originally buried by his comrades. He was probably buried perhaps by a shell hole. But again, this is all speculation based on the historical context that we can put together.
And what took you so long? What were some of the obstacles and challenges to figuring out who this person is?
Well, to be honest, this was fast. 5.5 years is fast. Just to give you an example, the longest that investigation that we've gotten in identification took 11.5 years to identify that individual. So not only do the remains not repatriated to Canada, so that means I have to travel to where they're located and do my analysis on site there. So just because they're found in August 2020, as an example, doesn't mean that I'm there the very next week to be able to do the analysis. So usually there's
Plus, it was the
someone.
pandemic. You weren't going anywhere.
Yeah, that's another thing. Actually, I did not get to France, if I remember correctly, until December 2021 because nobody was traveling. Another issue with this particular case is when we sent the bone sample to the DNA lab to attempt DNA extraction, we aimed for two different types of DNA, the maternal DNA and the paternal DNA. And it came back successful for the maternal DNA, but it came back unsuccessful for the paternal DNA, which means that the paternal DNA didn't survive in the bone, which tends to be common for that type of DNA. So when we started doing our research, we were having issues with finding maternal DNA donors for some of the candidates. So I sent the DNA sample, the bone sample, back to the lab and say, try again to get the paternal DNA. That in and of itself takes time. DNA is not instantaneous like you see on TV or in movies. It takes months. And not only that, and Alex can speak to this, finding family members who are willing and able to give a DNA sample can take a significant amount of time as well.
What was the problem in this case or the challenges you faced with this
Well,
particular family case getting them?
we weren't just looking at one individual in this case. When we're developing a candidate list for a case, it's on the basis of historical research. So what units are moving through an area, what the artifacts themselves tell us, who's missing from an action. It's on the basis of forensic anthropology, which of course Sarah is in the best position to speak about. But what the remains themselves can tell us, how old somebody might have been, how tall they might have been. But that very rarely is going to give us just one candidate. And in this case, we had a number of candidates that we were looking at. And for each of those, we had to research their families. We had to look into their lives, because with the types of DNA that we can use in the identification process, it's not just a matter of finding a family member. It's a matter of finding family members who match specific profiles. So, for example, for the maternal DNA line that Sarah was mentioning, everyone inherits their mitochondrial DNA from their mom, but it's only passed on to the next generation by women. And in this instance, Private Detmold, he had one sister, but she only had a son who died a number of years ago. And as a result, there was no mitochondrial DNA from there. Had to move up to his mom's family, looking at her sisters to see if any of them had any maternal line descendants. Nope. It wound up being, I believe, through his great-grandmother in that instance. And
Wow.
so frequently you're calling somebody up who has absolutely no idea who you're talking about. Particularly with mitochondrial DNA, where because it's through the maternal line, a surname generally changes with every generation, and so it's not even going to be a name they're familiar with.
So you
Since
had to do that and say, or you email them and say, this isn't a scam. I'm actually the Canadian government.
Look, I'm not sure there's a good way to start a conversation about, excuse me, could I speak with you about the First World War? But we found some creative ways of getting in touch with people.
Sarah, you're laughing. I mean, I know how that is because I've done it myself many times.
Yes, correct. And we do spend a significant amount of time reassuring people that we're not a scam. We're not looking for your money. And I myself also have been yelled at, been threatened that if you contact me again, I'll call the police. I've been hung up on. It's just part, unfortunately, of the job when you're cold calling people and they have no idea who you're talking about.
So how did we find out? How did you narrow it down to this 33-year-old man from originally England via Germany, maybe a little bit, and then Canada, little Australia in there too?
Well, we went through the list of candidates. That's through Melissa's research. I think we ended up getting a list of what, 11 was it, Melissa, if I remember correctly?
10 or 11, but a few of those we could rule out on a historical basis is that they weren't in the right place at the right time. And even if we find a cap badge, one of the first things I do is look at, is that unit in that place? Because soldiers often have things in their pockets that don't belong to them.
Which then we move on to the anthropological data that we get from the skeleton, especially age and height, which are estimated from the skeleton. But of course, many lied about their age when they're enlisted, right? So that means more historical research to find a birth certificate or a baptism record, which then gives us the proper age at death, which is what's vitally important to be able to compare against that list of 10 soldiers. So then we also look at their height, which is in their personnel file. And in this particular case, with Hill 70, there's about 1,300 Canadians that are missing from that battle. It's a huge number of missing. So when we're lucky and we're able to have a badge from the 107th, and in this case, it immediately reduced the list to like 10. I mean, that's a
It
very
checked and
small
it's
number.
11.
11? Okay, so,
Sorry.
and then we were able to narrow it down, I think, to 5 who were the right age and the right height. And then it's just a matter of trying to find a DNA donor for every single one of them.
And so you decided that when? In December, but we only found out now.
Actually, no, that decision was probably, we got those DNA test results, I think, in October of 2025. But then it's a matter of writing all the reports and making sure that we can convene the Casualty Identification Review Board. Everybody's available at the same time. And we were able to schedule the Casualty Identification Review Board in December. And then the board votes on my recommendation for identification. And then we have to then find the next of kin, because the DNA donor and the next of kin are rarely the same person. So it means more research again to find another person in the family. And then they're officially notified by the Canadian Armed Forces. And then we can make the public announcement and let the public know that this has happened.
What happened when you found the next of kin?
So we started looking at his siblings. So that was the starting point.
3 boys and a girl, Josephine, Fred, Julius.
Godfrey. Bert was the third of the 4 siblings, and each of them, as it turns out, had children. So it requires a bit of sleuthing to try and confirm whether they're living relatives. But we were able to confirm that for 2 of his 3 siblings, there were living descendants. And with next of kin, the last of Private Detmold's nieces and nephews died in 2024, so just a few years ago. But it meant we were looking at great nieces and nephews. And from there, it was a matter of contacting various people, calling them up through various means and saying, "Excuse me, can I speak with you about the First World War?" That information is then passed along to our colleagues with the Canadian Armed Forces who do the official notification. So for the CAF treats family notifications just as seriously as they would if somebody had died yesterday. And for them, it's very important that they're the ones to officially notify the family that this person has been found.
So did they literally knock on the door?
In this case, it was a phone call.
Where does this next of kin live?
All of Private Detmold's siblings ultimately wound up moving to Canada. So I believe the DNA donor was in BC, and I believe the next of kin was in Alberta.
Well, I know that his brother's buried in Alberta, so that makes sense, in Edmonton. So
with Private Detmold, there's both a lot that we know about him and a lot that we don't. We know that he's born on the 9th of July, 1884 in Hamburg in Germany. Although when he enlists in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, he gives his year of birth as 1885. He makes himself a year younger. We know he's the third of 4 children born to Frederick William and Nellie Rita Detmold. He and his younger brother are both born in Hamburg because it seems as if their dad's business interests have taken the family there at the time they're born. We know that he attends a school that I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this, Ellins or Lyons, in London. He and Fred both attend that. And in 1902, he and his older brother set sail for Canada. As of 1905, we know Burt submitted a homestead application for a quarter section near Shell River, which is just north of Roblin, Manitoba. He becomes the secretary of the Silverwood branch, the Manitoba Grain Growers Association.
And there's a lot of Jewish farm colonies. So having a young single man of a Jewish family who may or may not practice anymore move to the prairies and start farming is something we all have in our Ashkenazi background of Canadian Jewish history.
I grew
don't
up just outside of
know.
Hirsch.
There you go. So
I
you
grew up
know
not far
about it.
from Hirsch, yeah.
When you read about his, we call it yichus, his roots, I don't know if you found any other Jewish remains like this since I've been monitoring this, which is only maybe 20 years.
The Casualty Identification Program has existed since about 2007, and I joined in 2016. So I can't really speak in detail to what happened before. But in my experience, I believe he is the first where we have found that type of religious denomination that's been associated to an individual. There's never really been a situation where a birth certificate would have implied one religion and then the attestation papers implies a completely different religion. This appears to be the first instance where we've encountered that.
Because they're afraid to get caught by the Germans or anti-Semitism, they changed their religion on the paperwork. It was a protection thing. Some actually legitimately converted too. I'm very interested if any of the family that you were working with, is there any sort of Jewish DNA or Ashkenazi DNA? I don't even know if that's a thing that you do.
In terms of DNA, it's purely for identification purposes in terms of maternal lineage and paternal lineage. Like we don't look at anything else.
Okay. And then what about the family? Were they aware of the mother's prominent Jewish relatives?
Private Detmold's uncle was the first Jewish Chief Justice of the courts in England. He was also at one point Foreign Secretary, at one point Viceroy of India. So it's sort of a very prominent Jewish figure at that time. In this instance, the family really had no knowledge of anything to do with this side of the family. A lot of information had been lost over the generations. And now, for example, we can find his mother's birth registered with the Hambro Synagogue in London. We can find his parents' marriage record that indicates they were married according to the Jewish faith at the West London Synagogue. We know that Private Detmold was engaged. His fiancée was Violet Detmold, a cousin on his paternal side. We know that her brother, he's actually the only other Detmold commemorated by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission for the First World War. He dies of wounds just after Vimy Ridge. And in his instance, he listed his religion in his attestation papers, Church of England, although there's no religious emblem on his headstone.
So what happens now to his remains? Where are they and what are the next steps?
Right now, his human remains are in storage in northern France in preparation to be buried. So we send caskets overseas. The remains will be placed in the casket prior to burial. And we are currently working towards organizing a burial for July of this year. And we're working towards making sure that he is buried by members of the Canadian Armed Forces and with family in attendance.
Coming up, help this team find the family of a second missing Canadian Jewish soldier, Private Israel Nierenberg of Montreal. I'm wondering if you could all share, what this means to you. What is something that you take away from having solved this?
As a forensic anthropologist, the goal of the field is to return a name, a face to an unknown individual. When I'm able to actually do that, it's quite a special moment. It's quite a privilege to be a part of it, to make sure that this individual who ultimately died for Canada has his name back, has his face back, and now will have a headstone with his name and a place where not only his family, but anybody can go and pay their respects to.
Alexandra?
It really is a chance to think about the losses of the First World War on a very human scale, on a very individual scale, and being able to share Bert's story, being able to look into his life just a little bit and being able to share that with his family as well is really special.
And he's memorialized on certain places around the world, but he didn't have a grave. And for Jewish people, many other people too, I'm sure, it's so important. What does his family say? I know you said they are private and they haven't wanted to give interviews, but could you give us some kind of sense of how they've felt about all this?
I'll take this one just because I've been in touch with the multiple branches of the family at this point. Frequently, when we're talking about casualty identification about this story, it is a story of somebody being lost and then found. And in this instance, I think in many senses, Private Detmold was lost twice, where his story was lost to his family, not only his remains, but that knowledge of who he was and what he'd done. And so being able to share his story with his family, being able to bring that story back to them, and then not only being able to bring the story of his service back, but also the knowledge that that his remains have been found and identified was, I think, really special. Yeah, and the family, I think it must be an overwhelming feeling to get that call, but the family's been very appreciative.
And you've done what's called chesed shel emet. It's the last thing in Jewish religion that you can do for a deceased. And it's even more important because they can never repay you. So burying them properly, giving them a final resting place with dignity and honor is considered literally the highest mitzvah that a person can do in the Jewish religion. Thank you for this important work that you did, a holy work that you do.
Can I just add, may his memory be a blessing?
Thank you. Now, you don't know about his fiancée. She, with Violet's family, did you speak? Whatever happened? Did she remarry? Do you know someone else?
So we know Violet never married. She died in 1970. We know that one of her brothers, Philip, is killed with the Canadian Forces. So he's buried at Boulogne. So he dies of wounds received at Vimy Ridge. But we know very little about the rest of her life. In terms of his mother's family, in terms of what you were talking about, in terms of moving out of the Jewish area, moving out of traditionally Jewish areas, it is one of the interesting things that you can follow with census records. You can see his mom's family leaving Spitalfields and moving to Hampstead. You can also see some level of connection being maintained between Private Detmold's family and his maternal side. For example, in the 1911 census, you see Private Detmold's sister and his younger brother both living with their maternal grandmother.
The Isaacs.
Yes, yeah. I can think off the top of my head, for example, of at least one other Jewish serviceman who's missing from the Battle of Hill 70 and who's a candidate on our lists.
Who?
His name is Private Israel Nierenberg, 14th Battalion, the 15th of August. He's on my extended to-do list, but I think I have something like 400 candidates to track down for various cases.
But hang on, I'll help you. How do you spell Nierenberg?
Nirenberg.
From Montreal.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh my God, what if I help you solve it?
He was with the 14th Battalion, which is one of the regiments out of Montreal. But I'm happy to send those details through. That was just off the top of my head. Really is one of the wonderful things about researching these lives. It's a reminder of just how complex the Canadian Expeditionary Force was in so many ways. I've tracked down families everywhere from Ukraine to Japan.
It's been an honor so much to hear this great story, and we'll look forward to hearing about the repatriation ceremony. Is that the right thing to call it?
It's a burial ceremony, actually.
Burial ceremony. Give our best to the family and tell them that we'd love to hear from them. Thank you so much, all three of you, for joining me on the Canadian Jewish News' North Star podcast.
Thank you.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounded like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. If you know anything about the family of Private Israel Nierenberg, who lived on St. Lawrence Boulevard in Montreal and was killed the same day as Detman, please help the team identify his remains. You can write to me at info@thecjn.ca, or there's a link in our show notes where you can register with the government's Casualty Identification Unit. There is another strong Montreal Jewish connection to Detmold. The city's Jewish lawyers organization is called the Lord Reading Society, and my dad was once president. North Star is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman and Andrea Varsany. Michael Freeman is our executive producer, and Alicia Richler is the editorial director. Thanks for listening.